Good morning, friends. This is CEC live lecture series, and under this series we are having lectures on world literature, which is described as a kind of writing that connects, bonds the world in one kind of thread. There are experiences, there are political visions, there are cultural landscapes, there are many languages, and all these languages go around the concerns of humanity. And since humanity under this series is visualized as one all over the world, therefore the series is called World Literature. Under this series we have had a number of lectures so far covering regions, and today it is like yesterday, it covers Australia now from Canada, and the topic for the lecture today is Australian poetry. As an expert, we have Dr. Payal Nagpal with us, who teaches English literature in Janki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University, and she has done extensive work on literary theory, on drama, and she is a theatre person. And today she will be talking to us about Australian poetry, and she will make points, and then we can also have a discussion at the end. Let me tell you that in such lectures we have the last 10 minutes also reserved for participation by the viewers, and you can then put your questions, you can raise issues, you can add to what has been said, you can give your observations. So these things are welcome in the last 10 minutes, which means precisely at 10:50. For this kind of discussion, we have a toll-free number, and that toll-free number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, the toll-free number is 1-800-110-430. So now I request Dr. Payal Nagpal to please proceed with the lecture. Welcome, and please do so.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Today's lecture will be on Australian poetry, and we are going to be looking at the emergence and development of poetry in the 19th and 20th centuries in Australia. Before we actually start discussing Australian poets from Australia, we also need to understand the construction of Australia as a space, as a country where literature, poetry has a very big role to play. So first of all, a very crucial question, for instance, in this series on world literature, we've been discussing the whole notion of identity. For instance, how identity is developed, say in Africa, how identity develops in the context of the Caribbean, and these are very, very different experiences. So also from the perspective of understanding it through the lens of what we call post-colonialism, the idea of identity becomes extremely important. So when we look at Australia, we also look at the way in which Australia as we understand it today started taking shape, and what were the cross currents at that point of time that led to the creation of an Australian identity. And is there anything like this? Can we understand Australian identity as a monolithic sort of identity? So these are some questions that I am raising right at the beginning. So we must begin by highlighting the various currents, cross currents that constitute identity in the context of Australia, and as part of the continent that was at one time, many centuries back, part of what was known as Australasia. So a lot of the people of color moved from South Asia towards Australia, and these were the nomads, and as the landmass moved and shifted, the people settled there. This word settlement is very, very important, because when we look at identity in terms of Australia, the whole notion of settler identity becomes very, very crucial. But these were the first inhabitants, and though they settled there from different parts, but we will not use the word settler community in a sense for them. So many centuries later, it's only in 1770 when Captain Cook discovered the route from England to Australia. To the white imagination then, this also was then developed and made into a kind of settler colony of the British. So, for instance, so you have people who had moved there earlier. These were primarily, the nomads who moved from different continents to Australia. As the landmass separated, they continued to stay there. And it's only after the discovery of the route from England to Australia that people started moving from England to Australia to settle there. And these were the first settlers, in a sense, who move from England to Australia. So, it's very interesting to mark that initially England sent a lot of people who had been convicted, who had been sentenced to some years of imprisonment. They are the ones, or maybe people who were suffering some diseases and so on, they were the ones who were sent to Australia. So, these are the first people who, in a sense, settled there. And when I say the first people who settled there, only in terms of the settler, because you already have a section of the population which is the Aborigines, right, the Aboriginal people who were already staying there. So, as against them, you have a lot of people from England who start moving there, people who had been sentenced, as mentioned, to, let's say, 5 years of 7 years of imprisonment. They were shifted to Australia. So, then who were the original Australians? That becomes a very, very crucial question to ask, because the whole notion of poetry in the 19th century, that's when poetry emerges. So, the whole notion of poetry at this time is very, very closely entwined with the whole idea of Australian identity. So, if you look at the landmass and the two polarities, the whole idea of the Aboriginals, and then we have the English settlers there. So, they in their own very, very different ways, these people make this new land their own. So, we have the Aboriginals who are the inhabitants, because they are the first people to actually start civilization there, and it's only the settler communities that shifts from England, that's the second rung. So, gradually this becomes a way of forging, of creating new identities. And in the context of Australia, one must understand that there's a constant blurring of the lines of identity. So, for instance, we have identity of the Aboriginals, we have the identity of the convicts. Now, there are people who've spent a very major part of their life, for instance, in England, and now they are shifted to Australia. So, what does identity mean for them? And in a sense, the space that they are supposed to inhabit and live in or settle in is a space that is going to be, it's like a reminder, because it's a punishment, they've been sent there. So, then as one moves on from the generation of the first settlers to the next, there is the identity of people who are born in Australia. So, which means that identity is, Australian identity is going to be an extremely complex composite sort of issue here. So, the Aboriginals meanwhile were, of course, they were marginalized totally, and there are still other factions that left people feeling extremely unsettled. So, with this in mind, we take a look at the kind of literature, or specifically poetry, that emerged in the 19th century. And if we look at it, so as against the 20th century, by which time I wouldn't say that things are resolved, but the whole notion of identity takes on a very, very different meaning, so to say. So, for instance, in the 19th century, there was a struggle of both self and form, and there was this urge to evolve new forms, and this led to a presentation, in a sense, of the whole crisis of identity that is there. So, Aboriginal perception of what it meant to be an Australian was different from, let's say, the convict lineage, the Bushmen who were there, that led to a kind of development of a literature that was totally different. And of course, we have, in the 20th century, we have the New Age man, the New Age woman. So, if we look at the 19th century, we have what is called the indigenous culture, and this is the Aborigines, and the Aboriginal literature and culture was separate. So, when the whites, in a sense, came to Australia, and the route was discovered, and this place, of course, is called New South Wales, that's the eastern coast, and in 1788, Captain Arthur unfurl the flag in Sydney Cove. So the first kind of literature that we have, and in terms of the whole idea of the convicts, is somebody called Michael Massey Robinson, who was also known as the first poet laureate of Australia. Now, he was a convict who came to Australia in 1805, and he was born in England, had used poetry there, and it's very interesting, and that's the reason that I specifically referred to Michael Massey Robinson, the idea that he used poetry and he made a quib about an alderman in England, and so as punishment he was sentenced, I think, to about 5 years of imprisonment, and he was sent to New South Wales. He wrote numerous odes, especially in praise of the Queen. Now, it's very interesting that the form that is being used is that of the ode. The period that we are talking about is it signals the end of the 18th century and the beginnings of the 19th century. So a lot of in a sense remnants of old forms are being used, and the structure, the form is coming from the English or the European direction. So then there were other convict poets like Francis McNamara, who wrote ballads. So we have convicts who are in Australia who are writing a totally different kind of poetry. When I say different kind of poetry, I mean that the structure that they're using is, let's say, of the ode, is of the ballad, but the issues that they're dealing with, of course, there is the usual, poetry that praises the powers that be, the Queen and so on. But there is also poetry that is being written to understand the context to which this new context to which these convicts belong. And so as was the case, the influence of European forms of writing were used, and this was set against a very, very difficult landscape, the landscape of Australia. So gradually, in a structure that comes from elsewhere, poetry which takes into consideration the landscape, the flora, the fauna of Australia finds its way into this poetry. And so if you take a look at, for instance, a poem by Francis McNamara, he was also known as Frank the Poet, and he was originally from Ireland. So there's a poem that he writes called The Convicts Arrival, also known as A Convict's Lament on the Death of Captain Logan. So the Convict's Arrival itself is the title of a poem, and tells us a lot about the sensibility of these people who were now trying to adjust to new circumstances. But before we actually discuss this poem, I'd also request Professor Prakash to share his views on the construction of Australian identity, which is extremely problematic in the 19th century.
Yes, I agree with you. It's very problematic because people come from outside, they have their own influences to carry, then they move to a land which is totally new to them and which has some kind of an identity of its own. There are inhabitants, as you say, the Aborigines, who don't have that kind of literature which Europe would have. So there is going to be a clash at the social level and at the cultural level. And the other point that you raised regarding form is really very interesting, because the European writer in the making, or an actual writer, would have the baggage of the forms that existed where he lived. But then those forms will not be relevant to this kind of reality, because this reality is untouched by the countries in the world, and they have their own ways to express themselves. So there is going to be initially a clash. Maybe later on, if wisdom finally prevails, then people will start understanding one another, and some kind of base for harmony might be reached. But initially, as you say, it's going to raise a number of problems and questions, and literature has to then contend with these pressures.
So this was my sense also of looking at 19th century poetry in Australia, and especially in the context of their identity, looking at in terms of forms that would no longer be I mean, they will be used in 19th century England, but in a very different way.
Ode is a very developed form in Europe, and there is nothing like an ode or a background to the ode in the Australian landscape. Yes. in the 19th century. Yes. So how does one transplant something that grew elsewhere onto this new surface? That's going to create problems.
And
again.
This leads to debates of a certain kind towards the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century.
And and the other point that you raised regarding convicts, who have no sense of values, or socially they are not accepted in England, and they will have a double kind of whammy here. They just do not know where to go. And then if they start behaving as criminals, which they have a criminal past according to the penal code in England and Europe, then they behave as criminals. And then there are people in front of them who are inferior to them, socially speaking. They don't have the kind of technology, that kind of advancement which is there in Europe, and they will appear to be very straight away coming from the forest. So that is going to have prejudices coming up. So poetry might appear to be blind to these new realities that exist in this place.
And you very rightly pointed out, and there's a term for this kind of literature also that emerges in the 19th century in Australia, which is the Bushmen.
Yes.
And because the convicts did kind of stay in the wild, so they were known as the Bushmen. And so there's a lot of poetry about Bushmen, and there are collections titled Bushmen and Other Poems and so on. So yes. So in fact, if you take a look at this poem by Frank McNamara, McNamara, that will give us a very good insight into the whole the way in which literature by the convicts is kind of being created. So for instance, I'll just read out the first stanza of the Convicts Arrival. In transit storms, as I set sailing, like a bold mariner my course did steer. Sydney Harbour was my destination. That cursed harbour at length drew near. I then joined banquet in congratulation on my safe arrival from the briny sea. But alas, alas, I was mistaken. 12 years transported to Moreton Bay. Now, this very stanza presents a wide range of emotions. So, the storms are not just the storms that are there at sea. Of course, it refers to the harsh conditions that the convicts had to brave actually to finally reach Australia, but also to being displaced, because they are being shunted out from a country where they were born, where they grew up, and now they are being, as a punishment, being moved to another country altogether, different continent in a sense. So, like a bold mariner, he says, my course did steer. So there is boldness, there is courage, because they are braving these difficult situations. And Sydney was a place that where they would land. The route that was discovered, it landed people in Sydney. So Sydney was the destination.
And you rightly say there is a large range of emotions.
Yes.
Like it's a place that has ensured a safe arrival there, but then it's a cursed
harbour. It's just come to that.
Yes. The two do not connect.
Absolutely, because it is a cursed harbour, because it is a space where they are being sent as a punishment. So in that sense, it is a cursed harbour, and it's not as developed. I mean, if we really look at it, 19th century England is going to be very developed, and here they are going to have to brave climactic problems. Things are not as developed, wide, arid spaces, which is why Bushman literature.
And see the presence of Christianity, coming in, cursed harbour. It's a kind of a curse that is there on it. Maybe the Australian audience won't understand what a cursed harbour is. So ideologically also there is a kind of violence that's going to happen in Australia, because the kind of belief systems that Australia had at that time and the belief system that Europe had, they would not be in consonance with each other.
Yes, not at all, because I mean, if you look at it, originally speaking, people who were there in Australia were the Aborigines, and these were the settlers.
And they would be thinking about nature, about elements, about water, about dust, about all those heat and cold, whatever. And they are talking about curse.
Curse, yes.
So
for them, because it's a punishment. So he says that cursed harbour at length drew near, and then there is a reference to a banquet, and there's congratulation, because now these people they are alive and they've arrived safely at the harbour. So he says, on my safe arrival from the briny sea, but alas, I was mistaken. 12 years transported to Moreton Bay. So, because it is going to be a long span that now these people will have to spend over there.
Is there something that connects also them in Australia? The two people, the original Australians and the Europeans? I believe that the suffering that the outsiders have, that suffering is common to both. So that perhaps joins them, and it shows, I think, in the poem that you quoted. What do you say?
Between the suffering common to, as in the settlers and the Aborigines.
And the Aborigines.
Not really. I wouldn't say that, because the Aborigines were marginalized for a very long time. And however, the poets express the suffering. The poets too. Because the poets express both the concerns of the settlers, and this is something that will emerge a little later, because at the moment these were convicts who were trying to grapple with their own physical condition, so to say, of living life in a very barren sort of space, because obviously only with the Aborigine population Australia was not in that sense developed in the so-called industrialized way that England was. So that problem was certainly there.
So, should one then call it a kind of prehistory of Australian literature?
Yes.
Or the history will develop now,
yes,
but this is the prehistory.
Because the Aboriginal culture, I mean, more or less, was something that was oral in form, their songs and so on. So in terms of published form and the way we understand it, so yes, now of course a lot of Aboriginal literature is also available, but primarily in its published form, it starts around the 19th century. So you very rightly pointed out that it becomes a kind of prehistory in that sense to Australian literature. So, the Convicts Arrival is, and in another stanza he says, describing life further in Australia. So in another stanza, Francis McNamara says, our overseers and superintendents, all these cursed tyrants, language we must obey, or else at the triangles our flesh is mangled. That is our wages at Moreton Bay. For 3 long years I've been beastly treated, heavy irons each day I wore. My poor back from flogging has been lacerated, and oft times painted with crimson gore. So it's
horrifying violence.
That is absolutely horrifying violence, and it evokes images of complete horror and the kind of absolute physical exploitation that these people had to undergo there.
There is flogging, there is beating with chains, and the back has turned crimson.
And we can see a system that's evolving. There are overseers and there are superintendents. So they are the ones who are, reminds me of, I mean, of course, much later, 100 years later, of Bertolt Brecht's play The Good Person, where he talks about the overseer and the song of the 8th elephant. But we can see how people have to face this like real time, and how they shifted to this place, Moreton Bay, which signifies a kind of punishment and torture. So in a sense, it's very, very problematic, because on the one hand, they are people who are not in that sense the original inhabitants. They come, they settle there, but they do not come of their own will. They are being pushed there as a punishment. And the second thing is that their life there is not conducive to living. Because they are going to be tortured, and they are going to be, for instance, heavy irons each day I wore. And he says, my poor back from flogging has been lacerated, and oft times painted with crimson gore. So this in a sense creates a very, very difficult picture and of life in Australia, especially the life that the convicts had to lead. And secondly, very importantly, how this is a very important topic in a sense of early 19th century poetry in Australia. This is something that people who've actually come there from England are grappling with. And these are very, very difficult lives. And of course, if we look at it and move back again to the whole notion of identity in the context of Australia, it becomes even more complex and very, very difficult to kind of, unpack in terms of either this or that. It is a combination of all these things.
Identity also, brings in the place where you live.
Yes.
So if the place is inimical, if the place is dangerous, then you don't identify yourself with it. And then a kind of loneliness sets in. So you don't belong there. So where is the identity?
Yes. So and their identity, as you just said, that their identity is something that is totally evolving through this kind of loneliness, alienation that they are experiencing, which is not the anxiety of, let's say, a 20th century person. This alienation is very different. It's there in real time. It's there. It's happening in the society. It's out there. So, if we take a look at, one or two other poets of this period, we have W.C. Wentworth, who was a native-born Australian poet, and he wrote a very famous poem called Australasia, and it's in a sense considered to be a celebratory poem about the history. And then there are the bushranger poems and ballads. So there is an anonymous ballad called The Wild Colonial Boy, which is very popular, and it's also been sung. So it's one doesn't know who's written it. So I'd still like to just share this with you, and it goes like this. He was scarcely 16 years of age when he left his father's home, and through Australia's sunny clime a bushranger did roam. He robbed those wealthy squatters, their stock he did destroy, and a terror to Australia was the wild colonial boy. So we see that the kind of anarchy, in a sense, that is being carried into Australia, and a kind of the cult, in a sense, of the bushranger and the wild colonial boy becomes very, very important here. So the probability is that the person who had written this was a rebel and a convict who had then become a bushranger. So it tells us very clearly about the lives of convicts in the wild in Australia. So then there are these other poems, a point that Professor Prakash had raised about the understanding of the Aboriginal context, and poets are able to do that. They're able to kind of look at the suffering, let's say, of what it means to be a bushranger, what it means to be a convict, and also at the same time what it means to be an Aboriginal. So this is in a sense a very, very significant point. For instance, we have another poet who uses a very distinct romantic strain called Charles Harper, and he writes what is called an Aboriginal mother's lament. So he writes, he says, "Still further would I fly, my child, to make thee safer yet from the unsparing white man, with his dread hand murder wet. I'll bear thee on as I have borne, with stealthy steps wind fleet, but the dark night shrouds the forest, and thorns are in my feet. O mourn not, I would give this braid, thy father's gift to me, but for a single palmful of water, now for thee." So here is the mother who would do anything for the child and to protect him from the unsparing white man. So now this is where the complexity increases, because on the one hand we have for instance the convict who himself is being tortured, let's say, and is being kept under harsh conditions, and at some stage this shifts towards the formation of the bushranger and the kind of the cult of the wild colonial boy. And at the same time, there is the context of the Aboriginal population that is being marginalized, that is also facing violence at the hands of the white people. So this creates a totally different kind of crisis, in a sense, in terms of understanding either identity or the context of Australia.
I think the point that you have raised regarding Australian poetry in the early 19th century is the point of emergence, and that emergence faces the question of identity, as you rightly call it. So this is the first part, and in which Dr. Payal Nagpal has discussed this aspect of origins of Australian poetry in the early 19th century. Since we are covering a greater range of this, so in the second part of the lecture, Dr. Payal Nagpal will take up the question of poetry evolving further in Australia. Till then, wait. Thank you. Welcome viewers to the second part of the lecture, and in the first part we have covered, Dr. Par Nagpal has covered Australian poetry in the early 19th century and the way it shapes later. That will be the subject of the second part lecture that she is giving us. Dr. Par Nagpal, welcome again.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. So we were discussing a poet called Charles Harper and his poem An Aboriginal Mother's Lament, and the whole idea about how poetry actually looks at both the context of the Aboriginals and also the context of, let's say, the convicts and their suffering. But another very important strain that is there in both 19th and 20th century poetry, it is the entire natural landscape of Australia. That's a very, very important component in a sense. It's almost like thinking about the 19th century English romantics and the way they bring in the whole context of nature, especially Wordsworth. And one can see that kind of distinct strain. For instance, Harper presents the whole idea of the summer. Not a bird disturbs the air. There is quiet everywhere. Over plains and over woods, what a mighty stillness broods. And then there is a description of the grasshoppers, the birds, insects, busy ants who are found resting in their pebbled mound. The locust clingeth now in silence to the barky bough. And over hills and over plains, quiet, vast and slumberous reigns. So we see that in a sense with Harper we've moved on. We've moved on in time because we are looking at an identity now that's gradually in some sense, only in some sense, concretizing in the context of the Australian landscape. So, there are other lines like thirsty leaves rustled, hissed for the rain, and he talks about a garden of roses as a cool, sweet place, a nestling face. So, these themes that Harper raises become very, very important. Now, for a long time, a lot of poetry by women was not available, and then there is this very, very important poet of the 19th century in Australia called Ada Cambridge, who has written some extremely cutting edge and path-breaking poetry, because where everybody, for instance, the convicts, the Bushmen, are talking about their context, and then there are people who are talking about the landscape. So it's all very, very, in a sense, a male-centric discourse of Australian poetry that we look at. But when we actually look at it from the point of view of Ada Cambridge's poetry, we get a great insight into the problems that the women were facing. So, for instance, there's one poem in which Ada Cambridge writes, "For want of bread to eat and clothes to wear, because work failed and streets were deep in snow, and this meant food and fire. She fell so low, sinning for dear life's sake, in sheer despair, or because life was else so bald and bare. The natural woman in her craved to know the warmth of passion, as pale buds to blow, and feel the noonday sun and fertile air." So, the very, very, this is a poem called Fallen, and she talks about the woman and how the role of the wife in this sense is compared to the role of the woman who is the prostitute, who is the unattached one and is not somebody who does not fall within the purview of society in that sense, but she looks at the role of the wife as somebody that's totally akin to that. And I'd like to read that stanza out. "And who condemns? She who for vulgar gain and in cold blood, and not for love or need, has sold her body to more vile disgrace. The prosperous matron with her comely face, wife by the law, but prostitute indeed, in whose gross wedlock womanhood is slain." So, in the 19th century, Ada Cambridge, and she's writing towards the end of the 19th century. So, she talks about how the women have to face extreme poverty, and extreme poverty is pushing them into the institution of marriage so that they can look for their survival. There is no, it's totally devoid of passion, which in the first place pushes them to think about an alliance, but it is totally devoid of passion, it is totally devoid of any kind of comfort. And so she compares this and she says that, the prosperous matron with a comely face, whose wife by the law, but prostitute indeed, in whose gross wedlock womanhood is sin. So, and she's extremely clear, spares no words, and it's remarkable to see how a poet of the late 19th century is really way ahead of her time and is talking about issues that feminists have raised, let's say, in the 20th century. So, when she talks about this, what she's actually saying is that the institution of marriage, in a sense, totally destroys the notion of womanhood. It does not. It's not created there. It does not belong there. It's only because of, for want of bread to eat and clothes to wear, that pushes the woman there. So then there is a longish poem by her in very, very short stanzas, running into, I think, about 15 or 16 stanzas. It's called A Wife's Protest. And she says that those church bells chimed the marriage chimes when he was wed to me, and they must knell a funeral knell ere I again am free. So she says that the chime of the church bell signals the marriage, and it also signals that it's only with her death, in a sense, that she's going to get freedom from this institution of marriage. So in another stanza in the same poem, she says, I did not hate him then. In faith I vowed the vow, I will. Were I his mate and not his slave, I could perform it still. But beauty cannot be restored where such a blight has been, and all the rivers in the world can never wash me clean. So she takes it as a complete destruction of womanhood, a complete destruction of beauty for a woman to be married. And what gives an initial a sense of comfort, not even joy, I would say, the marriage chime, is immediately transports her to a moment where she's thinking of the death knell, the sounding of the death knell, because it's only it's as if it is the institution of marriage becomes a trap, and the escape from the trap will only happen with the death knell. And motherhood is again a very important trope that she totally rejects, and this very poem, called A Wife's Protest, ends with this idea: O nature, give no child to me, whom love must never embrace. Thou knowest I could not bear to look on its reproachful face. The idea that, and there was a lot of discussion in the 19th century about the kind of problems that women had to face, and one can see through both these poems, Fallen and A Wife's Protest, the role of the wife is something that is seen as extremely destructive to female sensibility. So which became very important, because a lot of literature that was otherwise available was literature about, as I mentioned, the Bushmen and convicts and so on. But the women were getting a very, very rough share in this sense, and their problems were not being looked at. So Ada Cambridge's poetry, in that sense, pushes us to think, and the kind of modern sensibility that Cambridge had, that she was able to talk about things in very, very clear words. She's not resorting to any kind of poetic device to hide behind it, but is actually expressing it in very, very clear cut terms. I'd request Professor Prakash to please share his views on a woman poet, Ada Cambridge.
No, and imagine that the lines you quoted and the poet you have mentioned is so very clear about the institution of marriage and its drawbacks, and it's a very powerful statement to make. She is saying in one of the poems that you quoted, wife by law but prostitute indeed. So this kind of paradox, that law makes a woman having that kind of title of marriage, and actually she is a prostitute. She is prostitute in her body, her emotions. And this kind of understanding of the feminine question is rare to find in the 19th century in as clear terms as this.
Yes.
I think the woman in Australia in this particular case has moved far ahead than the English woman, who would not talk so very clearly about the institution of matrimony.
Yes, and she's not using any poetic device, no metaphors, nothing is being used to hide behind it. She's saying it very clearly, and the fact that Ada Cambridge is able to actually relate this to the whole economic situation also, the reason why a lot of women are getting into this. I mean, it's almost like saying that given a choice, if they were secure, they were getting their bread, they would probably not get into an exploitative relationship of this sort.
Yes. And the honesty with which she talks about the warmth of passion,
Yes.
which is once again being polluted by the institution, and she has those shackles there. And I was also noting some other phrases like, a marriage is a trap. Trap means that it's some kind of a imprisonment that has been planned by society, and in order to kill the woman in her. So this kind of a statement, and in such stark terms.
Yes.
That is what makes this poet Ada Cambridge one of the most unique voices
Yes.
in Australian poetry.
I mean, she's like straight in your face kind of a poet, and
Yes.
she's just totally, saying it all.
And Virginia Woolf has yet to come.
And Virginia Woolf is, yes.
In the early 20th century.
Yes.
So this person is able to give that kind of a description to the institution, which the other people in the world we will see much later.
Yes.
That way she is a pioneer in this.
Totally a pioneer, and it becomes very, very important, and which is why I think Ada Cambridge is a very big reason for the kind of richness that we have in terms of 19th century poetry. So from the 19th century, as we move on to 20th century Australian poetry, we look at one aspect where there is an imitation of forms of writing from Europe, and there is an expression of the anxiety of existence, social critique. We then move into a period of the world wars. So there is the First World War, then the economic depression, and then a country that's located in that sense. It's on the one hand close in a sense to the whole Asian context, and is also in a sense isolated because it's a little away. So the context of Australia, because of its geographical positioning, is something that is understood in a very peculiar sort of manner by writers towards the turn of the century, in their very, very peculiar alliance with England for the wars, and then also their understanding that post the economic depression, Australia also suffered a huge setback, and a lot of people were out of jobs, so there was wide scale unemployment. So as a result of these factors in Australia, there was suddenly this realization that Australia now needs to kind of evolve an identity of its own, which need not necessarily be the one that is conferred on them in a sense by England. So and the need for a kind of democratic sentiment that would be specific to Australia in that sense. So however, at the same time, in towards the turn of the century, there is also this desire for a certain kind of nationalism, and the idea of constructing the nation in a certain sort of manner. So when we look at the first couple of years of first couple of decades, I should say, of the 20th century, there is something called the Jindi Woorobak Club of 1938, and Australian identity was understood by this club in terms of the Aborigines. So a point that one has been making throughout, that on the one hand there are these settlers who come from other places, and then there are people who were already staying there, the original inhabitants in a sense. So there were poets like Ian Moody and Rex Ingamells, and the idea was to evolve Australian patterns of thought and writing. So the idea was that any kind of Australian identity is possible only through the Aboriginal understanding. So looking at the creation myth of the Aboriginals, for instance, or everything had to be understood before the entry of the white man on the picture. So for instance, there is a poem called Campfires of the Past. Every night among the fires, men chanted to the beat of stick and boomerangs and clap of hands, of drone and boom of didgeridoo, the songs rising and falling, trailing, quickening, while eyes gleamed bright, through smoke drift, bodies shone, and dust in fitful glow amid the shadows. So this is about a campfire that happens, and this is about the Aboriginal people. So again, there is a poem titled Boomerang. So something that's used commonly by the Aboriginal people, and the poem goes on into a description of the boomerang. This piece of hardwood, cunningly shaped, was curved, so even while pickaninnies gaped at a warrior who chipped at it with pieces of flint, and formed it by meticulous dint upon dint. Outside his wurley he sat beside a tree, and chipped at it patiently for hours, not for me, but to kill the wallaby in the rocky pass, and to kill the fat wild turkey hiding in the grass. So how these people are looking at survival. So on the one hand, we see that there were poets who privileged what one can call a kind of nativist tradition, and understood Australian identity by going into that space of the Aboriginal way of life. But then there were others who felt that it was time now for poetry in Australia to move in a different direction, and it was important to be abreast of what was happening in the world. And what was happening in the world primarily meant taking on from the European forms, the English, the French, and so on. So here we have poets like Christopher Brennan, John Shaw Neilson. We have before them, we also have poets like Kenneth Slessor, and so on. So some of these poets shaped the course of Australian poetry in a certain sort of manner. And Kenneth Slessor is considered to be the father of modern Australian poetry in that sense. And like the English Romantics, he stresses on what is called a kind of vitalism that is there, the vitality of poetry, and has written poems like The South Country. So with this we move into another phase of 20th century Australian poetry with a very important woman poet again called Judith Wright. And she was born in New South Wales, and talks a lot about the Australian countryside. She talks about the concerns of the Aborigines, and she talks about the land that belongs to the Aborigines. So it's interesting that one has Australian poetry has, in a sense, when we look at Judith Wright's poetry, at least to my mind, it is able to put together, if not resolve, put together all the complex issues, questions, the contradictions that existed, in the different spaces. So, moving on from, let's say, the world of the Bushmen to a more clear understanding of the need for Australian identity to figure in poetry. She's able to combine the city spaces, in a sense, with the natural landscape of Australia and the concerns of the Aborigines. So, for instance, there is a poem titled Legend, and I'll just read this out. The blacksmith's boy went out with a rifle and a black dog running behind. Cobwebs snatched at his feet, rivers hindered him. Thorn branches caught at his eyes to make him blind, and the sky turned into an unlucky opal. But he didn't mind. I can break branches, I can swim rivers, I can stare out any spider I meet, said he to his dog and his rifle. And the poem goes on in this tenor, where the rifle is also broken later and so on. But the boy continues to say that I can break branches, I can swim rivers, I can stare out any spider I meet. So if you look at the way language is used by Judith Wright, certainly one has moved ahead of the literature by Convicts and Bushmen and so on. One is now talking about a certain kind of modernity in poetry, and it also this modernity never loses sight of what has happened in the past, which means that the history of Australia, the kind of emergence of Australian identity, Wright never loses sight of this, which is why she's talking about the blacksmith's boy, and she's talking about the harsh conditions that continue to exist, and she's also talking about the never say die spirit. That sense of bravery, that sense of courage is evident in this line. I can break branches, I can swim rivers. That whatever be the context, he says that I can actually kind of come to terms with it. I can meet with these problems, and at the same time there is another kind of poetry where Judith Wright is depicting the Australian landscape through a poem titled Egrets. So and she says, once as I travelled through a quiet evening, I saw a pool jet black and mirror still, and beyond the slender paper barks stood crowding, each on its own white image, looked its fill, and nothing moved but 30 egrets wading, 30 egrets in a quiet evening. So it's an image of a certain kind of peace that one can locate in nature. And
okay, just let me know. Yes.
And
Hello,
There is a
good
call
morning,
from
sir.
Yes, yes, please ask your question.
Yes, I want to know about various themes in Australian poetry.
Which stream?
I want to know about various themes in Australian poetry.
Okay, actually, that is being discussed by Dr. Payal Nagpal. If you would have heard, there was a stream, that talked about the early 20th century concerns. Then, it became modern, it became more complex, and initially it was about nature, and from nature they also went to the work of art, and that particular poem she quoted. So, I think this question is being addressed, and you can just relook the things later in the lecture. You will find that actually with every decade Dr. Payal Nagpal is pointing out something that emerges new in this. So, yours is a good question, and this question has been in fact taken care of. So, thank you for asking this, and maybe I will request Dr. Payal Nagpal to go over it briefly after this. Thank you.
Yes. So, to answer this question, that the different strains that are there in 20th century Australian poetry. So, as I said, that in the 19th century we've moved from let's say the convicts, the Bushmen, to a kind of pre-modern sensibility. But when we come to the 20th century, on the one hand there is the Jindi Warobak Club that wants to only talk about the concerns of the Aboriginal population, but there are these others who believe that in terms of form, in terms of ideas, one needs to now look westward and look towards for instance the European or the French forms, and they bring that into their poetry. Poets like Christopher Brennan do that. And when we come to a poet like Judith Wright, we see her talk about all these they find a kind of more smooth, a kind of smoother interweaving that happens in Judith Wright's poetry. So, from concerns about the Aborigines to a description, let's say, of the egrets, and then there is a description of a prison house, and there's a poem titled The Old Prison. And for instance, she writes, "The rows of cells are unroofed, a flute for the wind's mouth. Who comes with a breath of ice from the blue caves of the south? Who built and labored here? The wind and the sea say, their cold nest is broken and they are blown away. They did not breed nor love, each in his cell alone, cried as the wind now cries through this flute of stone." So there is this question, who built and labored here, is a question about the prison that is made, but is also a larger question about Australia in a sense, and the plight of people who would have spent their time in the old prison is kind of it's almost like a music that's now emanating from there. So with Judith Wright, we see a kind of settling down, but not an effacing. In fact, a more complex and a more firm placing of all these issues together, in a sense, in her poetry is quite visible. And she's able to kind of talk about all these issues in her poetry, and that is something that allows us to understand that with Wright, 20th century modernity has finally set in the context of Australian poetry. And if we compare this with what is happening today, for instance, there's a contemporary poet called Leigh Wicks, and there's a collection edited by K. Sachidanandan, and in that the collection begins with a poet from Australia called Leigh Wicks, and Sachidanandan refers to him as a stage and page poet. And it's interesting to note how in the present moment, how in the present day, the use of language is very, very different. So Wicks is able to kind of put together the vernacular, the English, the context of the day-to-day language, and yet at the same time one can see that this is a modernity of a different kind. So for instance, there's a poem called Damian Gives a Lesson. So he writes, "A lettuce is in your brain. This afternoon a discussion of palliation. There are clear answers to this quiz. You scoff at the notion of conquest and play guitar. Despite a lifetime of ropes, we hold hands despite a lifetime of hopes, say you never looked better, I'm right. So a lot of things are being discussed here. There's, on the one hand, it begins in a humorous sort of manner, a lettuce is in your brain, and yet at the same time there's a grim idea behind it. Then we hold hands, and despite a lifetimes of hopes, say you never look better. Even in other poems by Wicks, there is the phraseology is very interesting. So he has phrases like related cadaver, mint condition, spinal photographers. There's a poem that ends with this line, feed rice to the convertibles, try it with empty. So one can see that on the one hand, language has undergone tremendous change, but poets are still trying to combine the vernacular with language in terms of mainstream English, for instance, which means that it's not only about language, they're also putting together these different ideas.
My request, can you say something regarding Australian literature as a whole in 2 sentences as the conclusion?
Yes. I think Australian literature, especially in its richness and historical emergence, can be traced from the 19th century, when the Aboriginal context is combined with the settler context of convicts coming in. And in the 20th century, it blossoms in terms of a modernity that takes different forms, from Judith Wright, where these complex issues are put together, to a Levick's, in the present day, where language itself has undergone tremendous change.
Well, friends, in this lecture, we have moved from the early 19th century, which was the time of origin of Australian poetry, to the 20th century and later. And in this poetry, there are phases of development, the phases of evolution, and concerns are changing. For instance, in the 19th century, there was a kind of pushing away of, isolating the original Australian population. But in the 20th century, there are writers who consciously bring in the aspect of Aboriginal writing, and they start building a new identity, a new nationalism, at the center of which stand the original inhabitants of Australia. And then concerns develop from one part to another, and it becomes culturally, ideologically a rich formation in Australian literature. So with this, we come to the end of this lecture, and thanks Dr. Nagpal for giving such a scintillating lecture on Australia, so very comprehensive, and you are able to squeeze lots of details in just 1 hour. Thank you.
Thank you.